much for joining us today to this Public Banking Town Hall on behalf of Colorado Public Banking Coalition and Public Banking Institute. I am Micah Parkin. I'm Executive Director of 350 Colorado, and we're one of the co-founding organizations of Colorado Public Banking Coalition. Today, we're going to learn about public banking, how to get involved here in Colorado. We're going to hear from some amazing speakers, including Ellen Brown, author of Public Banking Solution and member of Public Banking Institute, from Representative John Singer, Boulder Mayor Sam Weaver, and Aurora Council Member Juan Marcano, Earl Stalin from the Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute, and many other community leaders from environmental, labor, housing, health, and faith sectors. And we're going to have a discussion on how public banking can keep our taxpayer dollars local and support our community's needs and values and restart our local economies and build local resilience, especially in times of economic turmoil such as what we are in currently. Today's schedule, we're gonna have author Ellen Brown speak, and then Earl Stalin from Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute to talk about why is public banking needed now. We're going to hear testimonials from local organizations and community leaders, and then learn a little bit more about the Colorado Public Banking Coalition and how you can get involved. And we're going to hear from Representative Jonathan Singer about pending legislation to enable banking options in Colorado. And then at the very end, we'll have questions and answer period with all of our various speakers from today. And so do hold your questions to the end. But if you can, if you'd like to put your questions in the chat, if they're quick, easy questions, then our presenters may go ahead and just answer them in the chat box to you directly. If you've never used the chat function in Zoom, you can hover your cursor over the screen, and at the bottom you'll see a little chat box pop up, and you can click on that and then type into the chat over on the right hand side of your screen. You'll also be welcome to ask questions directly, verbally, right at the end of the session today too. So thank you again so much for joining, and I'd like to now introduce Alex Sukatos. He is a board member of the Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute. Alec, please take it away.
Is he unmuted?
Alec, you're muted again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you. Thanks, Alec.
Okay. So I'm introducing Ellen Brown, author of Web of Debt, the Public Bank Solution from Austerity to Prosperity, and Banking on the People. She has a blog, Web of Debt, with hundreds of excellent articles, co-founder and chair of the Public Banking Institute, and co-host of weekly podcast, It's Our Money. She's also an attorney and author of 10 other books. So please, Ellen, take it over so that we don't waste any more time in introductions.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So I have a PowerPoint. You're pulling that up? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
There we are. Oh.
Anyway, great to be talking to you all. I'm in Los Angeles, cloistered in my alone in my senior village where I live.
Ellen, I'm not sure why the slides are not loading. I'll keep working on it, but feel free if you want to start talking. That is good too.
Okay. Well, we started the Public Banking Institute in 2011. Okay, yes.
There we are. Oh,
all right.
Done. They come back.
Okay, so we currently have like over 25 bills pending in different states on in various sorts of bills for public banks, mostly for feasibility studies for public banks. So you can see that on this map. We actually started, this is going to be, okay, next slide, I guess.
And I'm sorry, Ellen, I'm having a bit of technical issues here, but there we go. Sorry about that.
Good. So we actually started the public banking. Well, I started writing about public banking in 2008 and early 2009 because I knew that we had one state-owned bank, and that was North Dakota, and it was founded in 1919 and it's now been around for exactly 100 years. And so I was watching it, and it turned out it was the only state that escaped the credit crisis. It never went into the red. It had the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the lowest default rate, the lowest foreclosure rate, the most banks per capita. So I thought the bank must have had something to do with it, so I started writing on it. And that generated quite a bit of interest. And so we formed a Google group, and over the next couple of years, we had a lot of heavy hitters in this Google group, and, you know, like old social creditors and people that knew a lot about banking. There was one woman who was actually from the Federal Reserve. And so after a couple of years, we felt like we were the experts and it was time to get out there and do something. So we formed the Public Banking Institute in 2011. Next slide. Okay, I guess it. Anyway, we formed it in 2011 and immediately we were on a roll. We thought this was going to be easy. We had like 20 states that had brought bills, and one of them was California, where the governor had, or the bill had passed both houses of the legislature, but the governor didn't sign it. And that's the way it kind of went with the other bills. We kept coming up against roadblocks. But now we're on our second wave of bills, and we know we're more savvy now. We know what we're up against. And as I'll get to later, there are actually some new developments that are going to make it hopefully quite a bit easier to form a public bank. Globally, 25% of banks are publicly owned. The biggest is in China, where 80% of banks are, 80% of banking assets are publicly owned. So what they do in China, I think Earl is probably going to get into how money is actually created. Banks actually create money. They create it when they make loans. So in China, for example, if they want to build high-speed rail, they built 12,000 miles of high-speed rail in 10 years. How did they do it? How did they finance it? They just issued the money as credit or as deposits on the books of their banks, lend it to themselves, pay the workers and materials, and these are called self-funding loans, the type of thing that you've got customers at the end who will pay for the thing you just built, and then that pays back the loan. And that's how they do it. Next slide, please. And in the United States, Roosevelt did something similar with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in the 1930s. That was when there were no banks. It said, you know, the banks were going bankrupt and the country was broke, and we needed to get more money into the economy somehow. So what he did was he used the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that was formed by Herbert Hoover before him, and he greatly expanded it. And it wasn't really a bank, but he used it as a bank. So what he did was they capitalized it with $500 million from Congress. And over the course of the next 25 years, they turned that into $40 billion in loans. So they issued bonds. That's how they funded it. But most of the bonds were bought by the U.S. Treasury. And where did the Treasury get it? Of course, they went into debt. And the debt went way up during World War II. But because productivity went up as well, they managed to, GDP came up along with the debt, and so it all went down over time. Anyway, what they did again was these self-funding loans where they built like everything that would pay back. They funded railroads and dams and farmers, and they made loans as small as $25, but anything where they knew that it would be productive and it would pay back, they made that type of loan. So over the course of 25 years, they rebuilt the country and funded World War II, basically starting with nothing. And they turned a profit for the government. Next slide. Also during also during the Great Depression, we had a postal banking system from 1911 to 1967. So we actually had a very strong public banking institution across the country during that period. And it was particularly popular during the 1930s when, again, people were pulling their money out of the private banks because they didn't trust the private banks. And so they were putting it in the postal banks, which were paying 2% interest. It was a very good deal for them, but mostly it was safe and reliable. So we already had the infrastructure. You had post offices all across the country, and people would they could give their parcels at one window and go to another window and deposit their checks or pull out some money. So it's very convenient. The problem was that they were pulling their deposits out of the private banking system, which meant the private banks were going bankrupt. So, they were already going bankrupt, but this was collapsing them. And so the government, rather than supporting the postal system, passed a law for FDIC insurance, where we, the people, were actually paying, are actually insuring our own deposits in these private banks that we've seen are are corrupt, and they're using our money not in the best ways. So it'd obviously be better if we were able to use these for public purposes. And currently, Senator Kristen Gillibrand has a bill on for reestablishing postal banks, which would be very good right now, particularly when we have a problem distributing the funds that are supposed to go to individuals and small businesses. Then our one and only state-owned bank, except for the Bank of America and Samoa, which was formed 2 years ago, the Bank of North Dakota is a stellar model. In 2014, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that said it was more profitable than Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase. And they weren't even trying to be profitable. Their mandate says that they are to serve the local community. But next slide. But the reason that they're able to be so profitable is their business model. They've cut out all the middlemen. So they don't have private shareholders. They don't pay bonuses, fees, or commissions. They don't have any high-paid CEOs. They don't have to advertise. They don't advertise for loans, and they don't advertise for depositors. They actually collaborate with the local banks. So the local banks get the customer, and then if the local bank needs help with a loan, like they're too small for the size of the loan that's sought, then the Bank of Minnesota will come in and help with liquidity, help with capitalization. And so for this reason, they don't need infrastructure. They don't need branches. They do have one new branch now, so they actually have 2 branches. But you pretty much have to live right in the capital city to bank there, so that they don't intend they take 2% individual depositors, and all the rest is just the state itself. So the model is that all of the state's revenues go into the bank, and then they leverage they leverage their capital, backing it with the deposits. Next slide. So we often get this question from policymakers. They say, we've got plenty of banks, we've already got loan funds, we're already making the kind of loans that you're talking about. Why do we need to go to the trouble of setting up our own public banks? But the difference is, for one thing, with your loan funds, you can only lend the money once. So let's say you had $100 million in a loan fund. You lend it out for a year at 3%, you're going to make 3% on it. But if you use that loan fund, the money that you've already got in that fund, and call it capital, you can lend 10 times as much. So you can make 30%. Of course, you're going to have some costs, but the costs have radically gone down right now, as I'll explain in a minute. And the difference between public and private banks, we all pretty much know. The private banks are very expensive. So, and they're not investing in our local communities. They're not doing what we want them to do with our money. Next slide. Next slide, I mean. Among other expenses, there was a study in 2014 that showed that Los Angeles, where I live, was spending more on fees, just the fees to Wall Street banks, not counting interest, but just the fees, than on the roads. I mean, we spend a lot of money on these banks, and they are in charge of a lot of our investing, which looks good in the good times, but we lose a lot of money in the bad times, as like right now. In California, the school districts have had to get these capital appreciation bonds, which are very expensive. Some of them, over the course of 40 years, you wind up paying three times principal just on the interest. And for states that, or cities that don't have the money to meet their budgets, they wind up privatizing their assets. So they go into these public-private partnerships where, again, it's the private investors who take all the money, and it's the public that bears the costs. So we can, if we do it all in-house, we can save all those costs. Half the cost of infrastructure is financing. That's just a rule of thumb for infrastructure financing. Two examples were the Bay Bridge retrofit in San Francisco, where the taxpayers thought the bill that we voted on was $6 billion, but by the time you added in the interest, it was going to be another $6 billion, so $12 billion. And that was also true for the bullet train. It was supposed to be $10 billion, and by the time you added the interest, it was another $10 billion. Next slide. So we have some new rules that are, it's amazing what they're now allowing the banks to do as of March 15th. But we as state and cities could capitalize on that by forming our own banks, and we could take advantage of that. So they've, at the discount window, which is where the Fed lends directly to banks, they have dropped the interest rate to 0.25%, which is almost nothing. In other words, they're essentially doing interest-free loans to these banks. It used to be that nobody wanted to go to the discount window because the interest rate was higher than elsewhere. So what it meant was that there was something wrong with your credit, and therefore you weren't able to borrow elsewhere. And so then the stock markets, stockholders would freak out, and stock would go down, et cetera. So they just wouldn't use the discount window. But now the Fed is flying it open and said, come use our discount window, 0.25%. You can get 90-day loans there, and you can roll them over day after day after day. In other words, you've just got free credit or free liquidity. So you don't have to worry about your deposits anymore. Let's say you start with a certain amount of deposits, and then the state has to use up all their money to meet their budget. No worries, you can just get that liquidity at the Fed. There's no strings attached on what you use the loans for. So right now, the banks they're still making 21% loans on their credit cards. I mean, they barely, I think they dropped credit card rates by a half a percentage point from 21 point something to, or anyway, it's still in the 21% range. So there was no requirement that they pass that benefit on to us. They've also eliminated the reserve requirements. So again, you don't have to keep a certain amount of deposits in reserve. You can just, whenever you need liquidity, you just go to the discount window. And the good of all that. So if we did that if our states and our cities did that, we could be making 1% to 2% loans into the community and directing the credit where it's needed, which is not happening now. And this would deplete the tax base, which is now dwindling. I know the states are complaining that the bailout did not give in the CARES Act, the money that goes to the states, it's only $150 billion to start with, which is only 5% of the money that the that Congress is paying, not counting what the Fed is going to pump out on top of that, another 4 trillion or so. So they only get 150 billion out of that, but they're not allowed to use that for anything that was in their budget. Well, everything they do is in their budget. They budget it first and then they do it. So the governors are complaining that they can't use this money and they're going bankrupt. So somehow we need to get more money into the local community, and that's what we can do with our public banks. Could be getting interest-free money in to stimulate the local businesses that are going to seriously be struggling if or when we ever get this quarantine lifted. So that's my presentation pretty much. These are my 3 books on the subject: Public Bank Solution, Banking on the People, A Web of Debt, and my own website and the Public Banking Institute website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was a wonderful presentation. Alec, were you going to introduce Earl or shall I?
So Earl Stalen, who is the chair of Colorado Rocky Mountain Public Bank Institute, and he's an attorney. He's co-sponsor of a ballot initiative to establish a state-owned bank in Colorado. There he is smiling in the picture. And he's the author of proposed legislation to authorize city, county, and state-owned bank. Earl and I have worked together for the past 4.5, 5 years. And it's a wonderful collaboration because we're very, very different. And yet we look to do the same thing for Colorado with public banking. There you are. Go ahead, Earl.
Thank you, Alec. This first slide is an illustration of the private banking model and how they invest and where the money goes. As you can see, I think the most important information to pay attention to is off on the right. Private banks, the major Wall Street banks, want to maximize their profits. That's really their goal. And they're focusing more on short term, but either way, it doesn't necessarily enhance our local community. And you can see, as Ellen said, when you look at what they like to lend for, war, fossil fuels, private prisons, big pharma, 3P projects, public-private partnerships that are really a form of privatization, derivatives, speculation, asset bubbles, and maybe privatizing other things. Next slide. And with a public bank, we take this tremendous power to create new money that did not exist before, and we can invest it in our local community for things we really need. We can have loans for infrastructure, affordable housing, small and medium-sized businesses. The big banks don't like to lend to small businesses. So this makes a huge difference in the local economy, creates many more jobs because that's where most new jobs are. It's in small and medium-sized businesses. Healthcare, here in the COVID crisis, a public bank could have stepped in very quickly to ramp up productions of PPEs and other things needed to handle the emergency. Clean energy, student loans, sustainable development, and sustainable agriculture. Community broadband. Rural communities are very stressed when it comes to access to broadband and the internet, which really affects their economies. Also, publicly funded media, because our media are so influenced by their corporate owners and advertising that we don't always get access to information we need. Next slide, please. Here's an illustration of what public banks can do with conversion to clean energy. The German Sparkassen are 15,600 city-owned branches that are financing local economies. These are nearly 200 years old. They've never bailed out one of these banks. They're very stable because of their public nature, like the Bank of North Dakota, low overhead. They have, together with KfW Development Bank, which is also a publicly owned national bank in Germany, they've been funding the conversion to clean energy. See the house there, well covered in solar. Germany has been called the world's first major energy economy. Renewables generated 46% of its electricity in 2019, up from 6% in 2000. That's just one of the many things that could be done. And public banks provided 72% of the financing for that. In addition, you'll see in the second paragraph there, Germany's public KfW Development Bank has assured Germany that they will very generously lend to businesses to prevent recession due to the COVID-19 crisis. So there we have some very important benefits. In addition to the one at the bottom, Germany has the strongest economy in Europe, and its public banks are really its backbone. Next slide, please. Are public banks legal in Colorado? Some people have asked this question. I've heard that from legislators who were concerned that it might not be. We did our own legal memorandum, and we were blessed to have that looked at and then forwarded by Jonathan Singer, a representative who will speak in a few minutes. And he sent it to the Office of Legislative Legal Services of the state legislature, and they wrote a legal opinion concluding that a state public bank is probably legal under Colorado's Constitution. We would just need legislation to establish it. OLLS also wrote that home rule cities and counties can probably start their own public banks without new state legislation if they stay within their own boundaries. And under Tabor, which of course raises lots of concern in Colorado, a public bank as a Tabor enterprise would not be subject to the constitutional prohibition on multi-year debt. Tabor enterprises are exempt from Tabor limits on revenue and expenditures. So that's an important benefit for communities that have no way of getting new income without raising taxes. Here's a major new source of income without raising taxes. And eventually, actually, taxes could be reduced when the bank becomes successful and big enough. And that actually happened in North Dakota a few years ago. And the requirements are fairly simple for a Tabor enterprise. It's got to be government owned, but also authorized to issue revenue bonds. And it has to get less than 10% of its revenue from state or local government sources. Next slide. This illustrates what Ellen was pointing out, the difference between major Wall Street banks after 2008, even with their bailouts, and the Bank of North Dakota. Over those years, the Bank of North Dakota, profitable every year, 19.3% average each year compared to 5.8%, see on the far right. Next slide, please. This is a slide that was based on a study in South America, but it's a wonderful illustration of a very important difference between public banks and private banks. The public banks are on the right in blue, and they all lent more money in 2008, 2009 at the depth of the Great Recession. And the private banks are on the left in yellow or orange. And that shows that every one of them cut lending. Of course, what does that do but produce a depression? And a Great Depression is always possible. And we are concerned that that could happen again. But the public banks prevent that from happening. In North Dakota, the reason they did not have any recession in 2008 was that they increased their lending. Not that much, slightly to offset the decline. And as a result, they also stabilized all the private banks that they had partnership loans with, because they all kept those loans in operation. If more money needed to be loaned or if extensions needed to be granted, they did it. And what that does is prevent recession. That means your pensions aren't going to be wiped out. It means jobs are not going to be wiped out. Healthcare and everything else that goes along with a Great Recession. So that is an extremely important difference between public and private banks. Next slide, please. Oh, well, here it is. Here's an example of what Ellen illustrated with those big projects in California where the interest equals the principal. This is Denver's bonds just 2 years ago, $937 million, nearly $1 billion in general obligation bonds. The total obligation on that will be $1.7 billion by the time they're paid in full. Well, that means the interest is $763 million, or 45% of the total cost. And by the time the bank is paid for, which is a fraction of the cost, why we could make enormous savings. For housing projects, the cost of interest can amount to 77% of the total costs. So the savings might be even greater for those concerned about affordable housing, which is a widespread and serious problem. A public bank could save the cost of interest, which is paid through taxes. So we could save the pressure on taxes. Why borrow money at interest that the state or community can create itself without owing interest, or a much lower percentage? A public bank would cost much less to run than the cost of interest. Next slide, please. What's holding us back? Public banks respond to crises faster and better than private banks. North Dakota's Red River flood of 1997 caused enormous damage in Grand Forks, North Dakota. In the flooded out areas, there was an immediate cessation of mortgage payments on loans, and they immediately stepped in with loans for rebuilding. As a result, they only lost 3% of the residents in that area. In East Grand Forks, Minnesota, right across the river, same damage, no aid comparable to what was happening in North Dakota, thanks to the bank. They lost 17% of the residents in that area. Another example is Germany's public bank KfW, as I mentioned, and its robust response to the COVID financial crisis. Public banks are responding aggressively to the COVID crisis, both medically and financially. How much more medical equipment could we have had if we had public banks here? We could achieve all these things here in Colorado, and we might even consider creating public banks as an emergency measure due to COVID-19 and the financial crisis. In New Jersey, the governor actually issued an executive order last November to create a board to establish a state public bank. And now that this crisis has unfolded, that kind of emergency action because of health and public safety could actually be considered to take immediate action to put a bank like that in practice. And we have word from a former banking regulator in New Jersey that it wouldn't take more than a month or so to set up a new public bank. Next slide. This is our Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute, which is part of our effort under the sponsor, lead sponsor of this town hall, the Colorado Public Banking Coalition. So thank you very much. And these slides will be available when this conference is put online, this town hall. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Earl, and thank you, Ellen. That was incredibly interesting and informative. And again, hold your questions or type them into the chat. We will have Q&A for our presenters at the end so everyone can ask their questions and learn more. So next up, we have various community leaders and representatives of various sectors of our communities who are going to speak from their perspective about why they are supporting the concept of public banking in Colorado. And first up, I would like to introduce Dragan Mejic. He is a para member, that's Colorado's state pension fund, and he's a member of the executive board of Colorado Winds Labor Union. Dragan, take it away.
Yes, hello, and thank you. First of all, I would like to say on behalf of the Colorado State Employees Union, our thoughts are with all those suffering both the health and economic hardships of this pandemic. State employees dedicate our lives to serving the people of Colorado, and yet so many of the things happening now are beyond what any of us has seen in our lifetimes or know how to deal with. Big debt of gratitude to all the healthcare professionals who are dealing with this from that end of things. Economically, our ability to move forward and get past this is heavily dependent on the health of the state economy. And right now, that health is very poor with a $3 billion shortfall. The choices facing the state budget now are all bad. Everyone is suffering, and our ability to come out of this depends in part on maintaining public services to reduce damage to our infrastructure and keep our society functioning. Unfortunately, every place lawmakers look for relief now comes with strings attached. Thanks to TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and a complicated web of finances, our state lawmakers have to decide now not so much who to help, but who to hurt less. It is a process now of spreading pain around, economic pain that takes years to heal. You know, this is the second economic disaster to hit us in 10 years. The causes are different, but the results are the same. What we have seen laid bare is the complete failure of our current national and banking model to address the suffering of normal people. The largest and wealthiest banks and corporations receive trillions of dollars overnight in their bank accounts. Normal people wait for weeks for a small check to show up while they're struggling to pay for food and rent. This system has to change. We cannot afford to do business as usual and let the largest banks run our economy while so many people suffer. And it doesn't have to be this way. The solution is an economy based around public banking that serves the needs of the local community and state economy, not the one that serves Wall Street. The Public Employees Union is heavily in favor of opening public banking in Colorado. We will not be the first state to do so, but we should not be the last. The time is now, in this crisis, to reinvent how we see money and economic resources, to change how that resource flows through our society. You have heard today about the things public banking can do, but as state employees, we see firsthand places where a strong public banking system can shore up deficits and shortages. Not only the state general fund, but the entire state economy. The recovery from this pandemic doesn't need to take 10 years and be ready for the next collapse. Public banking is the engine we desperately need to put interests of the people of Colorado first and make our state an even more prosperous and healthy place to live today. As a leader in the State Employees Union, I pledge that our union leadership will do everything possible to make this a reality in our great state. This is something we believe is worth fighting for, and we are ready. We look forward to working with the Colorado Public Banking Coalition, who are the experts on getting this issue implemented in Colorado as soon as possible. And last, I just want to say a few words about the para-state pension. You know, that pension got into a lot of trouble in 2008, and it was just starting to recover. A pension that is about 100 years old and involves over 1 in 10 Coloradans. All our teachers, our firefighters, our state employees and prison guards and highway patrol all depend on this pension. And at any given time, half of them are paying into it and half of them are living off of it. And yet, once again, that pension, because of no fault of its own and economic circumstances beyond its control, is in peril again, probably the biggest peril it has ever faced. And the options to it are not good. We have a dangerous dependency on a toxic stock market. And the other option that used to traditionally fund pensions was the bond market, and that has been wiped out as well. There are no good options left for the pension, and the one I do see is public banking, and that's where my hope lies. And that's why I'm here today. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dragan. We really appreciate you being here. Next up, we have Marie Venner. And Marie is a faith leader, leader in the faith community from Colorado Call to Action, Catholic Network, and Together Colorado. And she's also a 23-year Colorado business owner. Welcome, Marie.
Thanks. Dragan, that was just such an eloquent statement, and especially after such good information from Ellen and Earl. So I should just say ditto for all of that. There's such good reasons to support public banking now. But from the faith perspective, we believe in the dignity of all people and the ability of all to live and thrive. And so this just makes sense as organizations and faith communities dedicated to the common good. And people first, life first, all life first. But from a business standpoint too, I mean, nothing could make more sense than eliminating the middleman where you can, reducing costs, getting much better leverage. It just makes sense in every respect. And we are really so blessed that there's such a good and obvious alternative way forward that would help us this much in Colorado. I'm also a lifelong Coloradan. So thanks so much to everyone today.
Thank you so much, Marie. Next up, we have Deb McNamara. She's the campaign coordinator for 350 Colorado, where she leads campaign efforts focused on defunding climate disaster and divesting from fossil fuels and reinvesting in the clean energy economy. Welcome, Deb.
Thanks, Micah. And I have a couple of slides as well, if you wouldn't mind bringing those up. Okay, great. So I'm here to talk just for a few moments about why environmental organizations have been focused on banks and targeting a lot of our campaign efforts on what we call stopping the money pipeline that's fueling fossil fuel infrastructures and projects and funding the fossil fuel industry, quite frankly, to the tune of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars every year. So I just want to highlight this. A lot of people don't realize this, but our public money, not only through pension funds, as Dragan was just speaking about para, it's happening through pension funds, it's happening through our banks, this money is being used to fund the climate crisis and human rights abuses, endangering our public health and safety. And unfortunately, the Wall Street banks are really leading this charge. So there's a really fantastic report entitled Banking on Climate Change, and I encourage everyone to look at that. I'll drop the link in the chat unless someone else would like to do that. But that report that was released last year highlighted that 33 of the major Wall Street banks funneled $1.9 trillion into fossil fuel projects, and that is only since 2016. And the disturbing thing for us as people working to protect the environment is that this is after many of the CEOs of these banks are stating verbally their commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement. So we see a big discrepancy here between stated values and actions. Furthermore, bank financing for fossil fuel projects is on the rise, and that's also very problematic. So we want alternatives, and that's part of what led us in the environmental community to public banks as a possible solution. We're also really excited and interested in the option of cities and counties being able to bank with credit unions. A couple of things I wanted to just pull out about why we so desperately need alternatives. As I just mentioned, a lot of the main Wall Street banks, such as JP Morgan Chase, which is leading the way in these fossil fuel investments, by the way, are investing hundreds of billions of dollars every year in very controversial projects. Many of them are not only contributing to our climate challenges, but they're also associated with negative health and environmental impacts, and also indigenous land rights conflicts and allegations of abuse. So there are those issues too that are obviously top of mind for us. As I mentioned, since the Paris Climate Agreement, JP Morgan Chase alone has funneled $196 billion into fossil fuel projects and infrastructure. And you can go to the next slide. So just a few more words about why we desperately need alternatives. Right now, state legislation prevents our cities, counties, and states from banking with NCUA insured credit unions, which means that their only choice is to bank with Wall Street and FDIC insured entities. So that's one of the things we're working on here in Colorado with Representative Jonathan Singer, is to change that. So again, this means that our tax dollars are going towards funding fossil fuel development and inadvertently contributing to human rights abuses as well. So I'm excited to hear, we'll be hearing from Jonathan Singer here in a moment about why legislation is needed and how legislation can solve some of these problems. So again, just really quickly, how we think we can fix it as the environmental community. We really want to see us moving our money from Wall Street banks to local and responsible credit unions and community banks. We'd love to see the option of being able to create public banks at the local and state level. Of course, we can ensure our own investment portfolios are green, invest in local solutions and resilience, and of course, keep pressuring. You know, it's not that we're not pressuring these Wall Street banks to change. We're desperately working on that as well. But we want to make sure that we can have alternatives. And that's why I'm so grateful to be here today and for all of the experts that we're hearing from, and truly excited to move this conversation and the action around public banking forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. Next up, we have Tom Gottlieb, MD. Tom got his medical degree at UC Denver Health Science Center. He had a 50-year career as an internist, including academic, private sector, and public sector medical work, such as medical director of the Denver Neighborhood Health Center and founder and medical director of New West Physicians. In retirement, he works to achieve universal health care financed by a public single-payer system. He's been on the board of Healthcare for All Colorado Foundation since 2011 and is now co-president. Tom, take it away.
Well, thank you. Glad to be present. I'll be talking about how to fix a broken health insurance system. And we at the Center for the Study of a Public National Health Insurance believe that health finance drives equitable health care. So we need to start with what Americans want to experience, and that is values of security, freedom, and justice, standard benefits at a reasonable price, and always want to know how much is this going to cost me. And the current system of private insurance is really a failure in meeting those qualities. And the solution is a social health insurance, and we have one in this country already, a Medicare model for 65 and older, plus others. And it needs to provide a financial plan, which the Medicare model does. And our research has led to expanding Medicare from birth till death, including the Medicare model without destroying it and taking the indemnity insurance into that model. So the goal is to eliminate private insurance, which really causes a major fragmentation and complexity within the system. The obstacles are predominantly in financing reaching that goal, and congressional action is really not likely very soon. Business strategy of acquisitions or mergers, I don't think we can merge with private insurance companies, but we surely can go about acquiring their assets. So we estimated the enterprise value at $714 billion in a $3.5 trillion business. This is the insurance business that we're looking to acquire. And the U.S. Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, really has a takings clause in which, if we take private property, that we really need to give them compensation. And the difficulty, of course, is many folks think that we got screwed by the insurance companies, so just take it from them. But I think from the legal viewpoint, we need to have an opinion in that area. Private insurance is really gives a misalignment of American values with business values. And I'm looking to explore the need for the financing area that is a banking partner. And of course, one really needs to consider public versus private, but I need to have a bank that aligns American values and need within a community with the financing. And I'm convinced that a public bank is superior to the private banks. So we need a legal opinion in terms of the takings clause. And finally, we do have a model just north of us, Medicare Canada. The initial financing was with a public bank. So I look forward to work with both legal and banking advisors and partners. And we surely have the business plan that really could forward this mission of fixing the broken health insurance system. So thank you for letting me be present here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gottlieb. Next, we have Blake Chambliss, FAIA. Blake is a retired architect and fellow of the American Institute of Architects. In 1968, he helped create a statewide nonprofit corporation to help local communities address their housing needs. He was on the Colorado Housing Finance Authority board for many years, and ever since has continued to focus attention toward solving the problem of affordable housing in Colorado. Thank you for being with us, Blake.
Thank you. In 1988, I on the board of the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, and we chaired a statewide housing analysis looking at housing issues and needs throughout the state. At that time, those needs were dire, and yet housing needs since have increased without a pause, worsening at each dip in the economy and falling further behind with each rebound as investors take advantage of the momentary crash in prices and then keep them away from the rest. Public banks can help prevent real estate bubbles that lead to the crashes, and they can help restore a collapsed economy. In Colorado now, housing affordability is at a decade low, even as we face another impending real estate plunge. 22% of Colorado renters, 166,000 families, earn less than 30% of the state's median income. 74 of those pay more than 50% of their income for housing. And another 157,000 are overburdened, paying more than 30% of their income for rent. We need new housing and housing stability for Colorado's working families. For instance, following the savings and loan crash of the 1980s, the Resolution Trust Corporation was created with a mandate to keep the housing affordable. They followed it with preserving more than 30,000 units of housing through their actions. There is no such mandate after the 2008 mortgage crisis, resulting in hundreds of thousands of foreclosed housing were sold to private investors, never to be affordable again. In the current recession, we need a mandate to help keep housing affordable and prevent it from being sold off to private investors. That's the kind of work that a public banking can help us achieve.
Thank you so much, Blake. We really appreciate it. So we've heard now from different testimonials about the need for public banking from our labor sector, faith, environmental sector, public health, and also housing. And next up, we have members of local government, 2 members of local government who are supportive of increasing banking options for our communities and of the role that public banking could play in economic resilience. And so first, it's my honor to welcome Sam Weaver. He is mayor of the city of Boulder, and he is an entrepreneur. He's president and CEO and co-founder of Cool Energy, Inc. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Micah. I really appreciate the chance to be here. Thank you all for being here. This is a nice turnout for this public banking forum. I want to thank Ellen Brown as well. I've read Web of Debt. I haven't read the other books that she's written, but very fascinating kind of historical perspective on the way public banking has been used in the United States in the past. And so I guess, you know, we started hearing about public banking a couple of years ago from 350 Colorado. And that made me start thinking about what the advantages to the city of Boulder would be if we had the option of using public banking. As Deborah McNamara said, we do not have the option right now of banking with any institution that's not insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And that's frustrating on many levels. We have talked with our staff over and over again about possibility of putting deposits either with credit union or with institutions which invest less in things like fossil fuels and pipelines and so on. And we've been rebuffed for a number of reasons, but the number one of which is we have to bank with an FDIC institution. And so one of the first things that I'd like to see changed as a mayor, who would, I think our whole council would appreciate more flexibility in our choice of banking, would be if we could use credit unions. I mean, that would be something that could be changed really quickly and would allow us to move at least the liquid part of our savings, the more liquid part, into the credit union. And that amounts to on order of $20 million that we could pretty much quickly move out of a national bank and into a local credit union where that money would at least circulate locally with the leverage that those deposits would have. You know, some of the goals the city of Boulder has are obviously a lot more renewable energy on our grid. And so project finance for that is always of interest, and having a public bank which would remove profit and which would potentially allow state funds to be deposited in a state-run public bank would generate the possibility of funding projects more readily. It would make projects pencil out better for renewable energy. And so that's something that we would be interested in at the highest level. I think you would find the city council very supportive of starting with a state public bank so that we could monitor how that goes and what the benefits are and how it's implemented in Colorado. Boulder's a home rule city, so we would certainly think about the possibility of creating our own public bank, probably on a small scale at first, just to make sure that we work through the motions, and then maybe expanding it. So certainly at the state level, we'd like to see that happen. From my perspective, speaking to folks around the city as well as the state, a lot of education is going to need to be done. When you say the word public banking to people and public banks, they're not what that means, just because in the US we're not nearly as familiar with the concept. And so I think this workshop is a good example of the kind of public outreach that I think needs to happen to thought leaders. So that folks understand that it's a concept that's been used successfully in North Dakota, of course, but in Germany is a very good example of how to roll out a lot of renewable energy. The federal government provided loan guarantees, and so that network of public banks had many of those early on solar project finance loans here in the federal government. So it was loan loss reserve, so it didn't cost the German government very much money at all, but through that network of public banks, it enabled farmers and community members to be able to quickly deploy solar power. I guess the other thing I'll comment on is I had not thought of the affordable housing angle until we were in this discussion. That is certainly something that would be a really nice synergy with public banking. Boulder thinks a lot about affordable housing. We're the most expensive non-resort community in the state, and so we have to take that challenge seriously. We have, by hook and by crook, created about 8% affordable housing in the city of Boulder. We now have a goal of 15% affordable units to lower income and middle income families. And so to the extent that public banking can help us with that, it's certainly something that we're very interested in exploring further. So I would say that, just to summarize, we are intrigued as a city by the option of public banking. We'd very much like a short-term action to be able to bank with credit unions, because that's something that we could change in the next budget cycle if that were changed. So that would quickly get more money circulating in our community. And then to the extent that public banking education can happen and we can get it passed at the state level, we'd be fully supportive of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Weaver. We really appreciate your leadership on this issue and many others. Next up, we have Aurora City Council Member Juan Marcano. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Micah, for putting this together. Thank you, Earl and Alec and others for sharing your expertise with us. This is a policy idea that is something very near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to say that I think we're getting some traction with this. in Aurora with our city manager and several of my other council members. Just, a little bit of local context. We have an ongoing $20 million a year and growing, unfortunately, deficit in just maintaining our roads in Aurora. And we have tried repeatedly throughout the last decade to pass ballot initiatives and questions, either, taking out debt or, increasing taxes to be able to, basically just keep our roads in decent shape. And, I think that part of what has been holding us back is just a lack of imagination as to what we are able to do and, different avenues to actually raise revenue without raising taxes. And I really think that public banking is something that we, not just us in Aurora, but I know that Arapahoe County is dealing with these issues as well, need to really take a hard look at. And I think that based off of the success of not just the Bank of North Dakota, but also I think it's the Chickasaw Nation's bank that was capitalized with $7 million or something very, very low. And today is worth over, has over $100 million in assets. This is something that municipalities, both large and small, and counties, both large and small, can really get after in an aggressive way. And during this crisis that we're all, experiencing, so many of our small businesses have had to shutter or at risk of going under completely just due to, a lack of access to capital, inability to actually get any of these small business loans from the federal government that still come with like a 3.5%, I believe, interest rate. Could you imagine what we could do with local banking that is more than willing and actually excited to support our local economy and these local businesses that make our city such a great place to live? If we could actually open up this lending, this capital base to them with reasonable low rates, with reasonable terms for repayment, because the interest of a public banking institution like that would be to make sure our community and our residents are healthy and wealthy versus trying to extract as much, profits from these communities as possible, like the private banking sector. So really, to me, this issue is one that is really a liberating act for our local communities. And I think it's something that the sooner we get more folks bought into, the better our individual jurisdictions and frankly our state as a whole will be. There is enough wealth out there. It just needs to be put into local controls so that our communities can all benefit from the fruits of their labor, as opposed to sending it off to Wall Street to then, invest in fossil fuels, foreign wars, and other things of that nature. So thanks again for putting this together. I think the educational outreach here is really, really important, and I'm excited to see what the future holds for public banking in our state. Thanks again.
Well said. Thank you so much, Councilmember Marcano. We really appreciate you joining us. So next we have Sophie Shivers. Sophie is actually a senior at Niwot High School, and she is an intern with 350 Colorado. She helped to launch the Colorado Public Banking Coalition with the various nonprofit organizational partners that kicked off the Colorado Public Banking Coalition at the very beginning of this year. So this is actually the first event of the Colorado Public Banking Coalition, and we're very grateful for Sophie for her volunteer help to kick off the coalition. So please take it away, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Micah. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. We just wanted to take a second to talk a bit about the new Colorado Public Banking Coalition that 350 Colorado, Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute, and others helped found at the beginning of this year. We got started because although many of our cities are leading the charge in progressive movements, they're unable to fund the things that the communities value the most because they lack control over their money. So our goal is to help create local public banks that are socially and environmentally responsible and that keep our money working in our communities. To help grow our movement or to learn more about public banking, please visit our website at coloradopublicbankingcoalition.org and sign on and support. We've gathered support from 29 organizations, including Rainforest Action Network and Physicians for Social Responsibility, 16 businesses, seven community leaders, including Mayor Sam Weaver, and well over 400 individuals. So please visit the website to sign on and support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And here's that website she was just saying in case you missed it, coloradopublicbankingcoalition.org. You can sign on to the support letter for public banking in Colorado. And as she mentioned, over 30 different organizations, and including one of which is a coalition of 33 organizations, so that is even far greater, actually. And lots of community leaders have already signed on, and we encourage all of you to, and businesses are also welcome to sign on. So next we have Colorado State Representative Jonathan Singer. He is a wonderful public servant. He is going to give us an overview of the banking options bill that he has been working on for at the Colorado State Legislature. So please take it away, Jonathan.
Thank you, Micah, and thanks to our previous speaker, Sophia, as well. Constituent services means a lot, but when your constituents are actually providing the public service, that means a whole lot more. So I really appreciate that. I've been representing Colorado's House District 11 up in northern Boulder County for, well, the last 8 years, almost 9 years now. And this will be my last year at the Capitol. And I want to thank Micah and Earl really for not letting go of this issue and really trying to find a new way to form a coalition to bring this to the table. I'll give a brief overview, and then I'll actually share with you what my call to action is really. The overview of this bill is pretty simple. It really creates an option for local governments, cities and counties, to be able to use other banking institutions other than our commercial FDIC insured banks. Right now, there's a prohibition in state law for that. This would also allow for the creation of public banks at the state and local level. The idea here is really to put these different issues on the table. And, I guess I'll give you the good news and the bad news. The good news is this is historically, we've seen bills like this before. It's bipartisan. The bad news is there's a lot of bipartisan opposition to this. And so the last time that we saw a bill that allowed local governments to bank with credit unions was about almost 10 years ago. And it was actually brought by a Republican lawmaker. He was in the House, now he's in the Senate. And he got 2 votes out of like 10 or out of 11. Don't kid ourselves, the banking industry has a very vested interest in killing even the smallest steps possible here. And so the question is, what do we do to get this across the finish line? And I think there are 3 things that I think about. Do we have the intellectual capital? Absolutely. Do we have the interest? It's getting there. And do we have the votes? And the answer is no. We don't have the votes yet in the House or the Senate to get something like this passed. We have, in all likelihood, we will come back to the Capitol in about 2.5 weeks. And there are a lot of lawmakers out there that don't want to stay there longer than another 2 weeks to do what is constitutionally required, which is to pass a budget and make sure we have a school finance act so we're funding our public schools. That's about it. And it was already mentioned that we're looking at about $3.5 billion in cuts. So this is going to be a really tough session. And at the same time, I'd like to believe that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I understand that during a crisis, there are sort of 2 things going on in my mind. One is I'm constantly putting out fires. If you haven't seen me on the video feed before right now, half the time I was looking down at my phone because every about 15 to 20 minutes, I'm getting another email, another phone call, another text message from a constituent that is struggling with their health care, their housing, their job, or maybe all 3 all at once. And when you're in a crisis, you don't always look at the big picture, but it's our job as leaders to not only consider how we put out those small spot fires, but look at the things that have created this crisis and made it worse. We know these things happen on a cycle, but it doesn't have to be this bad. And so, I'd like to focus everyone with a quote that Angela Davis said, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And I want you to think about that in this crisis. And I want you to reach out to your lawmakers at the local level, at the state level, and tell them that when you come back to session, we want to see new finance options out there for our local governments. And heck, let's even consider it at the state level too. Because that's our biggest hurdle right now, is there are people that, lawmakers that don't want to come back to the Capitol, sometimes for good reasons, because their own health is at risk, sometimes because they just like to see every bill go by the wayside because they don't believe in the value of government. And so it is up to each of us to reach out to our state House members and our state senators and tell them, we want you back and we want you doing your job, because there are frontline workers out there right now, healthcare workers, grocery store workers that are showing up doing their job. We need you to do your job. And if we aren't successful there, if we don't get this bill through this year, even though it's my last year, it's my guarantee that I will keep working on this. And the way that I will keep working on this is by pressing the issue at the electoral level. I know this is a nonpartisan group right now, but what I can say is there is an election on June 30th. There are Democrats and Republicans that are up on the ballot for their primary. If you're a Democrat or a Republican, you need to show up and you need to ask those people in elected office or running for elected office, will you support public banking options? And when they go, gee, I don't know what that is, give them my number or give them Earl's pamphlet or get them in touch with Micah. Make this an issue. Make this one of the things that we need to talk about, whether we're solving our climate crisis, our healthcare crisis, our housing crisis, or our jobs crisis. This issue, these issues can be dealt with through a banking system that works for everyone. So the bill hasn't been introduced yet, and we can't even get it introduced until we can show that there's sufficient support in the House and especially in the Senate right now. And so, so this is where we're at right now. In November, do the same thing. Make this a front and center issue. It's complicated, but then again, it's not. We all use banks every single day. So make this a component of who you want to, an issue of the people that you want to support. So that's my call to action today, is reach out to those folks. Don't just sign the petition. Please do that. But then when you're done signing that petition, go look up your state lawmakers. Go get their email addresses and their phone number. Google, who is my state lawmaker? It'll pop up. Pop in your zip code. You can do it. You've got city council members on your side. You've got me on your side. We need to be able to count to 33 votes in the House, 18 votes in the Senate, and then put this to the governor's desk this year, because we can't waste a crisis when we are losing people's homes, lives, and jobs. So thank you guys so much. My email address is repsinger@gmail.com. It's pretty easy. And you can also reach me on my cell phone, 303-875-4727. Let's start actually changing this and make sure that we're changing the things that we can no longer accept. And let's start with creating new banking options for our communities.
Thank you so much, Representative Singer. We appreciate your leadership in helping to increase banking options in Colorado. And we know California actually just passed a bill last year that enabled cities and counties to do public banking. And they have various cities clamoring right now to be the first, because it's kind of a pilot project right now. And they're only allowing, I believe it's 2 cities at a time to move forward. And so they're all vying for those positions right now. And hopefully Colorado can follow suit fairly as quickly as possible, because we know that it would help to restart our local economies and our state economy and provide local resilience that we so badly need. And sadly, this is probably not the last crisis that we will face. And so we need this type of resilience. And thank you again for your leadership on that to try and help make it happen. And so now we're going to move to Q&A with our speakers today, and you can either type your question into the chat box if you would prefer, and Deb will ask it for you, or Sophie, y'all can take turns. And or if you would like to just ask your question out loud, that would be great too. You can raise your hand if you would like in that function under reactions at the bottom bar of your screen, or just pop in would be great too. So let's go ahead and open it up now. And thank you so much. If anyone needs to go, we're going to go until 1:30, but if anyone needs to go, of course, we appreciate you being part of this today. And this presentation will be available on the Colorado Public Banking Coalition.org website, and also on Facebook. And we do have a Colorado Public Banking Coalition Facebook page, and encourage all of you to find us online and join and like the page and And again, I saw a question asking, where do you sign the support letter? Again, the support letter is on this website, coloradopublicbankingcoalition.org. So yeah, what sort of questions do we have out there? Deb, can you kind of help steer that?
Actually,
Micah, there's a couple of people with their hands raised that I can see. Do we want to start with them?
And Sophie has been compiling questions too from the chat. So it's up to you, Micah, if you want to start with chat or the hands raised.
Let's go with hands raised first, and then we'll go to the chat.
Okay, so Bruce Adams, you are first, and it looks like you're already unmuted.
Yes. Could you talk very briefly about how public banking could make industrial hemp industries more doable in Colorado?
You want to take that, Ellen? Oh.
So Ellen, you're muted.
I don't really know your local situation that well, so maybe.
So Earl or Jonathan, either of you want to take that? You both.
I'll launch it really quickly, Micah. I'll launch it really quickly. So hemp is actually partially covered now in the U.S. Farm Bill, which is making banking options a lot easier. There is actually one credit union, at least one credit union in Colorado that also banks the recreational cannabis industry. But this is a very, when you don't have access to traditional banking options, that's when loan sharks start to come in. And it is very expensive and very challenging right now for people in the hemp, especially in the recreational medical cannabis industry, to get and keep a bank account right now. And the requirements on the banks are very strenuous. It is actually allowed in federal law that you can bank what is essentially a federally illegal activity, but there are numerous reports you need to be filing all the time, and it is very tenuous, and it is part of the reason that you see the racial disparities in our cannabis and hemp industry is because they're not able to access the capital for loans, and then even if they do get the money, where do they put it? So, so Earl, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but I'll say I did try to create a cannabis credit cooperative in 2014. We went to the Federal Reserve. We passed a bill. It passed by one vote, actually. We passed a bill over the objections of the traditional banking industry. And the Federal Reserve said, you know what? This is really, we're going to punt. We're going to say the federal government really needs to step up on this one. So wasn't a credit union we were creating. It wasn't a public bank. It was its own private cooperative. That failed. A public banking option would be a reasonable option to consider, seeing as we don't need to go to A, the Federal Reserve, or B, the federal government.
Yeah, I think that's good. Jonathan, to what extent is the answer to Bruce's question dependent on federal action?
So what I would say is not much, thankfully. I think the federal government has basically taken a don't ask, don't tell sort of line with cannabis in Colorado, and that includes banking options as well. Basically, if we're not contributing to the black market, not contributing to out-of-state diversion, and in hemp, which is, a very different intoxicating component of the cannabis plant, it's a little bit easier because it's not federally illegal. And there is actually, like I said, there is new recognition in the new Farm Bill. And so I'm not sure it's entirely necessary for hemp right now, but I do know that folks in the hemp industry are sort of still in a little bit of the gray area that our recreational medical cannabis industry currently is in as well.
Thank you, Representative Singer. Julia, what other questions do we have?
It looks like Joshua Knight. I'm going to take you. Oh, there you go. You're off mute. Go ahead.
Hello, and thank you so much for everything that you've given us today. We really appreciate it, and the hope is really fantastic, and especially ending up with Representative Singer. And something along those lines, I did go into the chat, and thank you so much for putting that letter there that we could sign. And one thing I've seen from other organizations, maybe 350 as well, is that you make it really easy on your email recipients. and all we have to do is click a little button and it goes to our representatives, our senators and our representatives. Is that something that 350 could do, or the Colorado Public Banking Coalition, to something that we can send to our representatives both at a local and even a federal level? Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Deb, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can make, yeah, I can make this quick. Yes, I think that's a fantastic idea. And actually, I just put a link to a white paper that Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute had put together about this issue and why we need public banking right now in this time of crisis. So I think the Colorado Public Banking Coalition can definitely do that. And I'm adding it to our agenda for our next steering committee meeting. So that's a great idea. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks, Deb. Julia, do we have any more hands raised?
Yep, there's one more. It's Lynn Siegel, and then we'll move to questions in the chat, I think. So go ahead, Lynn. Unmuted you.
Sam? Yeah, Sam, could we get someone from this group onto the financial strategy, the new financial strategy group?
So this is Sam Weaver here. Lynn, I don't think we're quite there yet. I think right now the action at the state level, because we cannot, we're forbidden from banking with anything but FDIC institutions at the moment. And the first step would be to allow us to bank with credit unions. So until we have options, I don't think it's even something that we could talk about. It's in our lobbying agenda to lobby for this. So we have a legislative agenda and we have a placeholder for this in our legislative agenda to support both the credit union step and public banking in the state of Colorado. So to the extent that we're able to do something to influence state legislation, we're on it. And the Financial Strategy Committee right now is going to be focused on the city budget, the fact that we're going to lose $40 million in the next year. And so, Lynn, I think that committee right now is just going to be focused.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Weaver, and thank you, Lynn. So if we don't have other hands raised, perhaps we can move Deb to the questions that were typed in the chat box.
Sure. So what specific points can we immediately argue to the COB within the COVID-related budget deficit of $40 million to argue for municipalization and a 500-year flood mitigation at SBFP, which will provide long-term economic benefit and stability to COB?
Mayor Weaver, that sounds like for you.
Yeah, it sounds like it's for me. Neither one of those issues are related to public banking right now. So I won't go into the details of either municipalization, which is ongoing, or the South Boulder Creek flood mitigation plan, because each of those have their own stories. But suffice to say that at the moment, public banking isn't the main issue with either one of those. It would be great to have public banking as an option for bonding for municipal utility or for the work we're going to do in South Boulder Creek. So it would be a great to have, but it's not necessary right now for those projects.
Thank you. Would somebody mind explaining the relationship, if any, between a state public bank and the state pension fund?
Dragan Magic, would you take that question, please?
Maybe Dragan's not on.
I do recall him saying he had to jump off early, now that I remember. Earl, would you take it, please?
Yes, a state public bank would, of course, take state funds and then lend it out into the community. The pension fund, for example, PARA, takes pensions and invests those in all kinds of things that they think best to invest in. And what Dragan was pointing out is that they've been investing in things that don't really serve our community, that are fossil fuels, the banks that are funding fossil fuels, the banks that are taking local funds and investing them outside our community. But a public bank is committed to investing in the community. So there would be a very marked difference as long as the community, in setting up the bank, makes sure that the bank is specifically authorized to do things that serve the community and stick to that.
I guess my question was, would you envision the funds that are currently going to the para, could they go to the public bank?
That's what Dragan was suggesting, and we think that's a reasonable suggestion. We have suggested that perhaps up to 10% of para investments could be in a public bank. As Ellen and I mentioned, the Bank of North Dakota has averaged 17, 18% for many years now, profit or return on equity, and could easily pay, 6, 7% if we could achieve comparable rates or even significantly lower rates, while currently and for the past several years, para has been either losing money or getting returns on things like hedge funds and other questionable investments, returns of, I think, 3, 4% or something like that. Not very good returns, plus their losses.
Yeah.
Thank you, Earl. Go ahead, Sophie.
Oh, sorry, I lost my place. Could a public bank help facilitate financing of a single-payer healthcare model?
Undoubtedly so. In fact, I had an email exchange with Paul Hellyer, the former Defense Minister of Canada, who was in office some 40 years ago. And he's quite an expert on the Bank of Canada, which was a publicly owned national bank from 1939 to 1974, rapidly brought Canada out of the Great Recession and helped fund a major part of World War II, and was very robust and kept Canada out of date until it was terminated. But in 1971, they had such a robust economic situation that it was not an issue to establish national health care. And Paul Hellyer in his email said that the Bank of Canada had helped fund that, and in addition, they had public banks in 1 or 2 of the provinces that had funded hospitals, and then health care for all, leading up to the Bank of Canada assisting with establishment of national health care. So without a doubt, a public bank could play a major role in making that happen.
Thank you. Sophie, any other questions?
Yes. So what is the relationship between a public bank and a local bank? So how would a public bank use a small local bank or credit union?
Do you want to take that, Ellen? I'll answer that.
I think
The Bank of North Dakota.
Unmuted herself.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. So on the Bank of North Dakota model, the Bank of North Dakota works directly with their community banks, and in fact, it says in their charter that they are not allowed to compete with the local banks. They have 6 times as many community banks as other states. So the community banks really like them. The Bankers Association endorses them. And we've got our AB 857 that passed that sets out the parameters for a state bank charter, or a charter for a public bank in California. And included in there is that the municipal banks will not compete with the local banks. So what they do is, as I was mentioning before, it's like the local bank is sort of the front office. The local bank gets the customer. The local bank, let's say it's a real estate, some sort of development that's too big for the local bank, and the loan would have to go to Wall Street, and they would lose the customer. So instead of that, they can go and ask the bank in North Dakota, go and ask the Bank of North Dakota for help, and the Bank of North Dakota might buy down like they might contribute, say, 90% of the loan, but the local bank will still keep the client. They'll still be servicing the loan, and they'll still get a percentage of whatever the percentage was that they they wanted to put in of the loan. So they just partner with the local banks, and the local banks are dealing directly with the customer.
I guess I don't know what a local bank is. So it's obviously not Bank of America or Wells Fargo. Like in Boulder, what's a local bank?
It would be a credit union. It could include credit unions. We don't have very many local banks left. I know my local bank just turned into U.S. Bank, so they got up after 2008. But it would be good if we could, encourage more local banks.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ellen Brown. We are so happy to have you on, and I'm sorry to say we are at time. If there were other questions that people have, we encourage you to just email us. You can go to coloradopublicbankingcoalition.org to find the email address. You can sign on to the public banking support letter there. I want to just say thank you again to all of the speakers and presenters today. We appreciate you all so much, and thanks to everyone who participated. And we would love for you to get more involved with the Colorado Public Banking Coalition. And you can do that again through our website. You can sign up to get more involved and let us know. And we would love to have you be a bigger part of the Colorado Public Banking Coalition. And just wanted to again thank the Public Banking Institute for being part of this today and co-sponsoring this event. And wanted to mention that we do intend to keep working with the Public Banking Institute to hold more town halls on public banking so people can learn more over the next year. And thank you all again. Hope you all stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.